So we're going to talk about how to share your research with a non-scientific audience. We'll cover using simple text and structure, how to keep writing lively, 3 common writing models, and how to plan the 4 sections of a lay summary. So the research is finished and your paper is published. Why bother writing a clear language summary? What's the benefit? Well, every scientist and researcher and healthcare professional, government employee, not-for-profit employee, all of these people should be able to explain what they're doing, why, and how to a non-specialist audience. And a clear language summary helps to do that. It helps to bridge the divide between scientists and the public. It's an important knowledge translation tool that expands the audience for your research. It also moves the taxpayer-funded research from out behind the journal paywalls. It makes it easier to translate your work into different languages, which extends the reach and impact even further. And some journals now require the authors to submit a clear language summary or abstract along with the original research. And the journals will offer to do this for you. They have a fee-for-service option. But if you're comfortable with the skills, then you can write these summaries yourself and avoid the cost. And finally, most granting agencies now require you to submit a clear language summary as part of your grant application. And that's because they recognize the benefit of having a lay audience evaluate whether or not the funded research is meeting the needs of the general public. So clear language summary is also called a lay summary, and it tells the story of your research in an interesting way. So think of it as plain talk from the lab. So it doesn't dumb down the science, but it expands the audience for your research by making it more accessible. So lay writing has a few basic principles. The first principle is keep it simple. Simple, precise words and sentences that are organized into a logical flow of relatable information are the key elements in shaping your research summary. But keeping it simple can be quite difficult because researchers are trained and supported to keep things formal, to use the jargon of their discipline. So how do we go about making things simple? First, begin with simple text. So use sentences of 15 to 20 words. Longer than 20 words can become a meandering sentence that's tough to follow. Break the text into short paragraphs for easier reading, and avoid complex grammatical structures wherever possible. And use everyday words in place of complex words. So words like speed up instead of accelerate, or show instead of indicate. Minimize the use of jargon. Jargon is scientific and technical terminology that's specific to a certain field, a certain discipline, a certain expertise. There is almost always a less technical way to say something. So some examples of jargon would be you could convert neurons to nerves, or say cell death or cells that die instead of apoptosis, or swelling instead of edema. But if you must use jargon, then explain it in plain language or use an analogy. An analogy is a commonplace comparison that the average reader, average non-expert reader would find familiar. So in our AllerGen network, which is a health research network, we might use an analogy like a cell is like a factory, or DNA is like a spiral staircase. One that we've used before is the CD34 protein acts like a molecular Teflon. It coats the surface of cells, allowing them to slip into the tissues without getting stuck. Another tip is to avoid acronyms, but I will qualify this by saying sometimes, because sometimes acronyms are useful. And an acronym is a single word formed from the first letters of a string of words. So like NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. In science writing, most acronyms are not familiar, and that's why they're not recommended for lay writing. But they can save time and space, and they may make it easier for a reader to relate to it. So they can be helpful. If you use an acronym, introduce it after the full terminology has been used once, and then use the acronym from then on. In 2017, AllerGen investigators wrote a paper where they were talking about a gene they found associated with peanut allergy. And the gene was called, a very long convoluted name, it was C11ORF30/EMSY. But the investigators shortened that to MC in their paper, and we used it in our press release, and the media picked up on it as well. So it made it much easier for non-experts to read about the discovery and to remember the gene. Also, aim to write your summary at a grade 10 reading level. Most popular mass circulation publications like popular fiction and magazines, they're written at a grade 7 to 10 reading level. But it's a difficult level to achieve. So how do you know if you've achieved it? Well, there are online resources to help with that. There are free online readability calculators. And these help to measure the accessibility of the writing by evaluating the difficulty of the vocabulary and the complexity of the sentence structure. So on this slide, there's a link to a popular readability calculator. It uses 7 formulas to analyze your text and tell you what grade level it's appropriate for. There's also a readability tool built into Microsoft Word, and it will give you a grade level score as well. So these tools are rough guides, but they can be helpful to give you an idea of how difficult your text is. But the best test as to whether your summary is appropriate is to ask someone who's not familiar with your research, maybe a neighbor or a friend or a colleague in a different area, but ask them to read your summary and to point out any words, sentences, or concepts that they don't understand. So keeping it simple also means simple structure. A clear language summary should have a logical flow of ideas from the reader's point of view. So you need to figure out the sequence in which your research story should unfold so that it will be logical and easy for your readers to follow. But a logical order might not be a temporal or a sequential order, and that's okay. The order should be that you flow the information in the order that it will help your reader get from point A to point B quickly and easily. And also, we need to remember that the reader may not have prior knowledge of the topic. They probably don't. So don't skip over information that may seem obvious to you, but is actually important for them in order to follow the thread of your research story. Achieving a simple structure doesn't just happen. It requires a very clear, thought out plan. Think about who you're writing for. Who is your audience and what do they need to know? And then write down all of the findings and messages from your study. Choose the 3 most important and then put them in order of importance to your reader, not in importance to you or to your colleagues or necessarily in the order in which you found them, but the order of importance to your reader. And then plan a logical flow of the information to share these 3 key findings. Ideas should be introduced as they come up in your story, but also be careful about introducing a new idea late in the text. The second principle of clear language writing is keeping the writing lively. To do that, we use the active voice. So the active voice emphasizes the doer in the action in a sentence. So it's the subject in the subject, verb, object sequence. And the active voice is direct, clear, and concise. In contrast, the passive voice emphasizes the receiver of the action, and it can create awkward and clunky, wordy sentences. So for example, we could say, you left the kitchen in a mess. That's the active voice. The subject, you, is right up front in the sentence. Or if we said it in passive voice, the kitchen was left in a mess. And in the passive voice, it leaves us, the reader or the listener, with a question in our minds. By whom? By whom was the kitchen left in a mess? The McDonald's famous phrase is in the active voice. I'm loving it. It's not written in passive voice. It is being loved by me. So to write in the active voice, put the subject and verb up front in the sentence and close together. So use the subject, verb, object sequence, such as in I see you. On the left of this slide, we have 3 examples of passive voice. We can convert these sentences to active voice by rewording or reordering the subject, verb, object sequence. So we could convert this first sentence. A new planet was found by scientists. We could convert to active voice. Scientists found a new planet. The second example, the DNA was subjected to analysis. Could become, we analyzed the DNA. And the last sentence, to investigate the source of nutrients, eggshell membranes were compared. We compared eggshell membranes to investigate the source of nutrients. The active voice works so well and it's so powerful because readers make rapid mental images when they're reading, and the active voice has the who and the what of the action right up front in the sentence, so it's clear and concise. So here's a tip to help check for passive voice in your writing. Try adding by zombies at the end of the sentence or after the verb in the sentence. And if the sentence makes sense, then you probably have passive voice. So if we take those passive voice examples we just mentioned, a new planet was found by scientists, but we replace it with by zombies. The DNA was subjected to analysis by zombies. To investigate the source of nutrients, eggshell membranes were compared by zombies. In all 3 of those examples, the by zombies actually works in the sentence, so we know that it's passive voice, and that's when you're reading your own writing, you can highlight those sentences to go back and reorder the sequence of the subject, verb, object, so that you can get to to active voice. So this is a table from Peter Backer in the UK, who analyzed the frequency of passive voice across different types of writing. So passive voice is not common in novels and magazines because they're largely focused on human characterizations and people, where someone is doing something. Business writing has a higher frequency of passive voice, and it's typically a mix of people and facts. But as we know, technical and scientific writing has used the passive voice more frequently because it suggests scholarly distance and objectivity. But with the push to make scientific writing more accessible, this is changing, and we're aiming to achieve normal, everyday speech. But sentences that have no people in them are just not the way that we normally speak. So it's not really fair to ask a reader, a non-expert reader, to follow a train of facts, a train of thought that is all facts and actions, but no actors. So to fix it, put the people back in. Use active voice. I thought I would mention the structures of 3 writing models. The first is the structure of a scientific article. It's in a traditional pyramid form. It begins with the introduction, moves to the methods and results, and then ends with the discussion and conclusion. The most important information about the results and what they mean are left pretty much to the end. In contrast, the structure of a typical media article, the kind you would see in news writing or reporting or blogging, uses an inverted pyramid. It begins with the lead. So the most important and attention-grabbing information is right up front. The who, what, where, when, why, and how, they're all front-loaded into a couple of really thin paragraphs right at the beginning. So there is no introduction. It begins with the conclusion. The body is main information, sort of the main content of the article, and then the tail is background information, context. You'd often see links to related articles so that the reader can move on and read something else that's related if they're interested. So you can see how this structure works well in news articles where the reader can skim all the key facts quickly and move on. The lay summary is a hybrid of these models, and it looks more like an hourglass. It begins with the broad to tell the reader what the research is about, and then it narrows in to the more specific. What did the researchers do? What did they find? And then it broadens again to talk about how can the research be used. So in AllerGen, we use the hourglass model to produce clear language summaries called research sketches. Each sketch was written by one of our trainees, a highly qualified personnel who had been part of the original research team. And the writing training and editing support were provided by the AllerGen office. These were 2-page summaries, so it's longer than a lay abstract, which you might be preparing more often. A lay abstract is typically 250 to 300 words. But these 2-page summaries are built on the same principles, so I thought we could look at a few excerpts from some of the research sketches to see how to create the structure of the lay summary and how to apply some of the keep it simple, keep it lively writing tips. So before our trainees wrote their research sketch, the first step we asked them was to figure out who is the audience, which non-expert audience are you writing for? Are you writing for a specific target group, like a policymaker group or healthcare professionals or a patient organization, maybe the general public, maybe the media? Or are you writing for a very broadly audience that encompasses all of those groups? So spotting the reader with the most interest in your topic will help you plan the story that you need to tell. You also need to think about what does your audience need to know. So keep the focus on what the reader would understand and find useful in their context. And then in simple, plain language, write down the 3 most important findings from your study and list them in order of importance to your reader. And then you build your summary around those. So the first section of the research sketch was titled, "What is this research about?" So we had 4 clear delineated sections, and the subtitle of the first section is, "What is this research about?" And in our format, this section was typically between 5 and 7 sentences long. Here, we highlight the problem the research sets out to solve, focusing on the so what for the reader. So why does the research matter? Is it a new finding that will change practice or policy? Is it incremental progress in an area that will inform future research? There is a link between even the most esoteric research and the way in which it could benefit someone. It's your job as the writer to help your reader identify what that link is. For example, you could tell your reader that understanding the way this protein works may lead to a new treatment for blood disorders. If it helps to tell your story, explain how your research fits into the bigger picture. Include any background information that's important for your reader to know in order to understand your story. If context is not needed, then leave it out. And this section is also a good place to define any terms, any acronyms, and to introduce any analogies. This is an example of what is this research about. It doesn't come from our research sketch, but it comes from a lay summary in a UK competition called Access to Understanding. And I thought it was quite well done. So I'll give you just a moment to read these couple of sentences. So this introduction highlights the problem or question that the research is aiming to answer, and it really focuses on the so what relevance to the reader. So I thought it was kind of a nice example. The next section of the research sketch is, what did the researchers do? And this is based on the methods section of the scientific article. Here we focus on the key points that will help your reader understand how you carried out the research. How many participants did you involve? What questions did you ask? How did you collect the data? It's not necessary to describe every detail or every step. If you do and it's too long, then the reader will lose interest. But it is important to let the reader know the main points about how the research was carried out so that they'll really appreciate the results and the meaning of the results. And this section could also be around 5 to 7 sentences long, but typically it's shorter than the earlier section, what is this research about? Now this is an example from a research sketch of what did the researchers do. And in this example, we find the active voice and relatively simple language, and as well an abbreviation, SIGA, which was explained in an earlier part of the research sketch. So I'll just read the beginning. The researchers studied 403 infants and their mothers who are participating in, and then there's a description of the study. Mothers in the study completed detailed questionnaires about their distress levels throughout their pregnancy and after their babies were born. Mothers and caregivers also provided information about their breastfeeding and infant feeding practices, medication use, and home environment. When the infants were 3 months old, the researchers measured SIGA levels in their stool and compared the baby's SIGA levels and their mother's level of distress to look for a relationship between the two. So that was written by Leanne Kang as part of her research sketch, A Mother's Distress During Pregnancy and Her Baby's Allergy Risk. The next section in the research sketch is, what did the researchers find? And this is the most important part of the clear language summary. So if the previous two sections have been well composed, then a description of the main findings should flow quite easily from the story that you've already built. Here is where you explain the three main findings from your study. If there are more than three important findings, you can include them, but it's often good to use some kind of visual delineation so that you don't have really long sentences about this finding, this finding. So you may want to use bullet points. You may want to use a text box or a sidebar off to the side, but ideally, 3 is the maximum you would want to be highlighting. When you talk about the findings, back them up with simple, clear evidence or data. If you report an increase, then you could say the growth doubled, or in the such and such increased by 31%. So give statistics. Present your findings in narrative text. Try to avoid graphs or diagrams or tables, the kinds of things that would be in your scientific article. If you have an image or graphic that has been designed for a lay audience, then that would be fine to include. So here's an example from another sketch. What did the researchers find? The researchers found that the new dendritic cells turned off the allergic response to peanut and egg white protein. Within 4 weeks, mice that received the dendritic cell treatment had a 50 to 90% lower anaphylactic response compared to those treated with saline. Now you'll see quite a few complicated words there, but things like dendritic cells, anaphylaxis, etc., were explained in the earlier part of the sketch. The final section of the research sketch is, how can this research be used? In a few concluding sentences, you discuss the importance of your findings, but not just in terms of the importance to your field, but in terms of their relevance to the lay reader. How do your results relate to people, communities, health, technology? So try and find a relevance in the bigger world. And then focus on this so what for the lay reader, and also on the current and future potential impact of your work. You could also relate in this section, relate back to a compelling finding that you've mentioned earlier and use it as part of your wrap up. Also, you can provide suggestions as to how the research could be used by various groups, parents, doctors, policymakers, etc. And here's an example from a research sketch by Lorena Veiling. She says, this research suggests that mothers, including those with asthma, can help their babies develop healthy lungs and reduce their risk of wheezing by breastfeeding. The protective effect is stronger with longer and more exclusive breastfeeding. However, even partial breastfeeding can be beneficial. So when you finish the 4 sections of your lay summary, you can finally think about a title. That should not come first, although it's quite tempting to write a title for your research story before you fill in all the 4 sections. But it's best to leave that to the end. So what makes a good title? It should be short and catchy. It should indicate what your research is about, because you don't want to mislead the reader with a really catchy title that has really nothing to do with what you studied. However, the title shouldn't give away all the key findings right up front. So if the results are given in the title, the reader won't really be interested to read any further. So some possible title formats are 3 that I've shown on the slide here. The question format is often very effective. Are girls really better readers is kind of a nice title. Are children's and youth's diets affected by their environment? There's the statement format, gender, race, and the chances of promotion, or listening to the brain when the body cannot speak. Another format is to use a simple version, sort of a plain language version of your original research title. Missing in Action, Fathers in Child Welfare. Then below the title, a lay summary often carries a subheading, which is kind of a short lead or a hook to capture your reader's interest. And according to the Nielsen-Norman Group, nearly 80% of online readers will scan a page before they commit to reading the text. So the subheading can be quite important to get people interested. It's kind of an extension of the title. If the title asks a question, it might give one more piece of information intended to draw the reader in. So when you finish drafting the summary, I have an 18-point checklist that we'll be providing in the resources after the webinar that you can go through to make sure that you've covered off the tips about simple and lively writing. The checklist will help you evaluate the flow, the simplicity, the liveliness of your writing. It asks questions like, have I kept sentences and paragraphs short? Have I written at a grade 10 level? Have I used everyday words, etc. But as I mentioned earlier, it's important to get feedback from someone who's not in your field. That's really, even when you've gone through the checklist and done several rounds of editing of your summary, the best thing to do is ask someone who's not in your field. So a friend or a neighbor or grandma, ask them to read your summary and tell you what they read. If they can explain to you, and if they can understand it and explain it after the first time, then you've done a really great job at writing the clear language summary. And then for final edits, when you think you've got it just right, print your summary in a new font. So print it out in font you're not usually using, and print it larger or smaller, and then read it. And you'll see potential for improvement when it's visually different from what you're used to seeing. And then read your summary out loud, and you'll hear potential for improvement as well. So 3 takeaways about clear language writing that I'm hoping you are going to walk away with today. Keep it simple, keep it lively, and use the model that we were talking about, which is the 4 sections of the lay summary. What is the research about? What did we do? What did we find? And how can it be used? And then I have a list of resources, links to online resources. So there are readability calculators and thesaurus in there that will help you convert complex words to everyday words, and a few other examples available on clear language writing. And I also just wanted to mention that the Research Sketches program was developed with input and resources from York University and McMaster University, and I want to thank those groups for their support and resources. And that is it. So I will turn it back to Diana.
Correct.
All right.
Has raised her hand. So I'm unmuting you, Correct. If you unmute yourself, you should be able to speak now. Go ahead.
Hi, Kim. Great presentation. I'm in love with the science communication, and I'm trying my best to talk to the patients that I work for. I'm just wondering, like, why do you guys prefer research sketches, or like what are the advantages of research sketches over the infographics?
You know, the infographics are excellent tools, and I think like they're very useful for social media. So if you can do a really simple infographic or any kind of a diagram, that can be very, very effective on Twitter and other social media platforms. So the research sketches are more for a written audience. So we would often include them when we were sending packages to policy groups or to that might be considering supporting allergen research or investing in the child cohort study. We would use them at conferences. We were assuming they were more a takeaway where someone would read them online or from a hard copy. But the infographic is actually extremely effective, and we did use a few of them, but they weren't part of the research sketch.
Thank you, Kim. Marshall, any other questions?
No other questions at present.
Great. I have a question for you then, Kim. Given that you have educated and coached dozens and dozens of trainees in terms of how to prepare these research sketches, what in your experience are the most common challenges or barriers that first-time research sketchers experience when trying to put their detailed scientific findings into a lay format?
Interesting. I think that I saw the same challenge crop up almost every single time for each of the trainees that was a research sketch writer. And that was getting a logical flow. That seemed to be the hardest, the hardest skill to learn in that sentences could be written in a simple way, etc., but the story didn't flow. And if you don't know the research or familiar with it, then I would find it myself, I'd be reading it and I'd have to backtrack another two paragraphs above in order to follow where the story had gone. So I think the biggest challenge for new writers is getting a logical flow. So I really encourage you to use the plan, to write down the 3 key findings, put them in the order of importance to your reader, and then plan transitions. So I'm going to start with this finding and I'm going to explain it, and then I need a nice transition to the next one, so that the story makes sense all the way along.
I think that's a critical observation for us all to keep in mind with anything that we're writing. In fact, it's those transition points that allow us to tell a story that people can understand and remember. Well, thank you for that.
Yeah, we have a written question from Kelly Wang, who asks, when you're presenting your conclusions in slide format on slides, is it better to use the passive or active voice? And I imagine the point here is that you can be more concise if you omit a full sentence with the subject, verb, predicate. So does it ever make sense to use the passive voice in the slide presentation?
I don't think so. I think it would be more effective to have you could have if it's a slide presentation and you want to have bullets or your key findings listed, then you could say we found, which is the active voice, and then the bullets would be the fragments of the sentence. We found 31% increase in such and such. So I would still encourage you to use the active voice.
All right, so Kim, I thought your slide with the 3 different types of titles was really interesting. And do you think that a lay audience relates more readily to any one of those 3, or did you find yourself that when people came up with a question for a title, that it really piqued people's curiosity right from the get-go and it encouraged people to read it? Did you find one worked better than the other?
From my personal preference, I like the question format because I find that it gets the reader trying to anticipate what the answer would be, and then you become invested in finding out. So I like the Are Girls Really Better Readers? Or Girls Better Readers as a title, because for me, I know that the research or the story is going to be about literacy skills between, comparing girls and boys. And it's suggesting that girls might be stronger readers, but obviously it's left open. So I'm quite invested in finding more out. So that's my personal preference. We didn't see any difference in the uptake of research sketches based on a question versus a statement title. And we did have sketches with using all the different formats.
Thank you for that, Kim. I found that myself when I was looking at that. I thought, oh, the questions, yeah, are they going to be myth busters in terms of the response, or is it going to confirm sort of the prevailing conventional wisdom? So I tend to agree personally with you on that. Given there's, you started out telling us it's really important to pick the 3 key messages that are relevant to your reader. And I thought that really makes a lot of sense, because Leah has been doing some work with everyone in our HQP program about being really sensitive to who is your audience, because we know more than we can say, and we certainly know a lot more than we can say in the 20 minutes you often get to give a talk. But even in the context of writing something on 1 page or a short research sketch, we know so much more than we could fit into that, and trying to tailor our findings to what we think our audience is interested in, who are our target readers, is really challenging. And certainly when you're writing a scientific paper for a journal, you're acutely aware of who that audience would be and who those reviewers and editors will be, and you write to the restrictions or the requirements of any given journal. And when you think about writing for your an audience that's sort of parallel to that exercise, where you're probably writing to one of those pyramids versus the hourglass style, when should you start thinking about and planning your lay summary? Does it matter if you think about it parallel with writing the academic paper, or should you do it after or before you write up your results? What do you recommend? Is there any perfect time slot to start working on that lay summary?
Yeah, great question. I encourage people to prepare a lay summary. Now it's going to be a short one at this point, but before they conduct the research. So because it's critical now to have lay summaries as part of a grant application. So I would say once you have your research question and your methodology and you've thought all that through in order to apply for a grant, write a lay summary at that time, even if the granting agency is not requiring it. And or if you're not applying for a grant, but pretend imagine you are applying for a grant and write your lay summary right then. And you won't have all your findings obviously to fill in, etc., but you can in 200 words begin the story of why you want to do this research, why it's important, and what you'll be looking for and what you hope to find. So I would say before conducting the research, get a basic one done, and then that gives you your template to flesh it out into either a 2-page feature story, more like the research sketch, or just a complete lay abstract afterwards for publication.
Oh, that's very interesting. So do you think that hourglass format works for those kind of lay summaries in your grant application as well?
Yes, I think so. I think so. If you look at CIHR, which is Canadian Institutes of Health Research, may not be as applicable for the admin grants, but they have an outline of what they would like to see in a lay abstract, and it's exactly that. So it's, it's the start with the broad, but you can talk about the broad and the broad, maybe the specifics of the narrow part you don't have all the details for, but you can, the research sketch format does align very well with what the granting agencies would be looking for.
Well, I think there's other sort of spin-off uses for these plain language summaries, and we often encourage our trainees to develop an elevator pitch, about their research. What is it you're working on? And you meet Dr. Cullis in the hall, who's our scientific director and one of the leading people in the world in lipid nanoparticles. And he turns to you and says, so what kind of project are you working on? What research have you recently published? And to have that lay summary, I'm sure that's a help in terms of getting your 3 key messages that you have in that 30-second encounter, at your fingertips. Or if you are invited to sort of pitch the next stage of your research, and they say, well, where are you at in this type of field of research? It also gives you an opportunity to quickly summarize in a very logical, as you say, connected, understandable way what you have accomplished to date, and then add on where you're going. In terms of examples, I think there were, you talked about breastfeeding research, but are there people at AllerGen, organizations that are, in a hub and spoke model where they use your research sketches that have been provided from the students' research, but they're sharing it with a broad group of pregnant mothers or something like that?
Yes, we did. Yeah, our partner organizations all used the sketches and made them available to their communities. But one in particular was the Health Nexus Santé group, which is a health advocacy promotion group for maternal and child health. And they were very interested in the research sketches that had to do with breastfeeding. And so they disseminated it to they had 3,000 nurses, like nurses, prenatal nurses, midwives, etc. So a lot of healthcare professionals working at the grassroots with new moms and new families. They found that it was very, very helpful to have something like that to share with families.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. And I'm sure, in terms of, we're all in a competition for people's time and attention. If people were really interested, do you encourage people to put the reference to the original full paper and the journal article at the bottom somehow, or they could look it up if they wanted to?
Yes, we did that with research sketches. We had the trainee, their principal investigator, and their institution sort of in a nice sidebar, as well as a link to the original research paper. The lay audience typically is not going to go to an original scientific article and read it, but it is nice to provide it, and especially for the media, if they were to pick it up and then they often want to see the original article. I would also mention that there are, many journals are now open access where you can see the whole article and not pay a fee, but there are many that still require a fee. And so it's important, if you can, especially if you're tweeting about your research or in a research sketch, to have a link to something that would be an open access version.
Right. So it just creates a much greater level of accessibility to your research findings, and to position you as a subject matter expert with a much broader community who may subsequently ask you to come and speak to them or to work with them or help them advance some major scientific challenge in their field. Marshall, do we have any other questions from the audience at this time?
Yes, in fact, we have a written question submitted by Erica Ladisseur, who writes, "Thank you for your informative talk, Kim. Do you have any recommendations with structuring or wording of your research sketch or lay abstract when your objective is to encourage a discussion?"
Well, first of all, hello, Erica, who we know from the AllerGen Network formerly. That's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about that. So if you're trying to encourage a discussion, so as opposed to sharing concrete findings, I think that the principles would apply. I mean, you would start with why is this topic of interest? Why is it important? And then specific questions about what can be done to address this issue. So start with broad questions and then narrow it into specific questions, and then broaden again to the discussion about how would the answers to these questions impact someone? How can they be applied by various groups? So wording, I can't specifically say what that would be, but I think the principles would apply, except that your narrow scope where you would usually be saying what your 3 findings are, you could specify what do we need to know specifically in the terms of the bigger picture, what gaps are there and how do we need to fill them, and what are some options that we can do to achieve that.
Great, thanks, Kim, and thanks for the question, Erica. If you could give your top 3 reasons of why it's worthwhile to put the effort in to trying to develop the skill set that enables you to be able to put together clear language summary of your research, what would the value propositions be, short and long term, for anyone who's interested but not sure it's worth the time, how would you pitch the it's worth it argument to them?
Yes, important. That's very important to be able to do. Well, there are public interests and personal interests, but public interest, I think it's quite well accepted and discussed now that the general public pays for research in Canada, and so they are paying for this research. So we need to be able to explain what we've done to show that, to demonstrate why Canada is investing money in research. So I think there's a sort of an obligation to the taxpayers to be able to explain what the research is and make it accessible to everyone. But there also, of course, are personal benefits for your career, because if you can explain your research clearly and concisely to all different groups, you will have many opportunities for collaboration and networking that you might not otherwise have. You'll be able to reach beyond your specific silo or discipline to have cross-disciplinary opportunities to collaborate on research. And from the AllerGen network, we know that the networking that occurred within our NCE allowed researchers to be published in journals in areas that they never would have before. So I think if you can summarize your research clearly, concisely, both written and verbal, the 30-second pitch and maybe a 3-minute pitch as well, that you're very comfortable with delivering, then you'll have many, many opportunities for your career trajectory that you wouldn't have otherwise.
That's fabulous, Kim. I think you're absolutely right. And with I think the bottom line here is it's worth the effort, and it's a highly transferable skill. And so it will serve you well to develop this skill set early in your career, because it will be a tool in your communication toolkit for the balance of your career and set you apart from those who have not put that time and effort and energy into a conscientious effort to make your scientific communication clear to the lay audience. So on that note, I'm going to ask Marshall if there's any final questions.
I'm glad you asked, because 2 comments have come in. I'll share.
Great.
I'm sure Kim will be happy to hear from. Eduardo has a comment. He says, "Wonderfully explained, Kim. I'm writing a 1,500-word manuscript and find it hard to synthesize 30 years of research in a relatively small piece. Some of the tips Kim shared are very useful, and I'll use them for this manuscript." And then Erica Ladouceur again says, one more smiley face. "Any recommendations for changing your mindset to easily step into someone else's shoes and leave the scientist out to help change your voice?"
Great question.
I'm wondering if Erica can elaborate a little bit on her question.
She may be writing, I can't tell. Or Erica, if you have a microphone available to you, you could raise your hand. I could let you speak. There she is. Okay, if you unmute yourself, you should be able to speak, Erica.
Sorry about that. My voice isn't great today. It's more because I think when we're writing scientific papers and everything, we tend to think one way, and then as you were mentioning with the students that you worked with, they all had kind of a similar challenge with having more of a story and making it flow. So I'm just thinking, is there any tips to maybe being able to step out of the scientist role and put yourself in someone's shoes that doesn't know the research or the science or doesn't have that vocabulary?
Okay, thanks for clarifying, Erica. Yes, I think the process of asking for feedback is really, really important, because if you approach someone who's not in your field, then they can help you. If they're willing to really sit down and edit for you, they can highlight words. They can say, I don't understand how this goes from that to that. And Eduardo, who just asked a question, he wrote a great research sketch, and we went back and forth editing many times. I'm sure he would attest to trying to get the story so that I could understand his research, which was extremely complex, and in depth with Dr. Dean Beefus. So I think working with either a partner, like an editing partner who's not within your field, would be a great way to do that, because that they will be able to keep sending it back to you and say, I understand the first paragraph now, but I don't understand how it connects to 2, or I get that point, but it's, but didn't you already say that? So I would suggest getting an editing partner outside of your field, and use that person throughout the process rather than just at the end, which is what we talked about before. I think that will help get you out of the researcher voice and into the perspective of your audience.
And Erica, I'll just jump in and add my 2 cents on that question too, because it made me smile. I had a colleague way back in the early 2000s when the whole knowledge, we called it knowledge transfer back in the day, in the original old days of knowledge mobilization, knowledge translation. But he would always say, imagine that you're writing this report so your mother can understand it. So as a starting point, think about your mother. If she can understand it, then that's a good sort of conceptual audience just to start off with, and then you can share it with others. But it is a challenge to find, I think, the correct the appropriate voice, and hit the right pitch for these things. So it does take some practice, but I think you're on the right track, Erica. If you can get these little mental strategies in place, then that certainly will help you follow Kim's rubric in terms of how to excel in these kinds of exercises. So, well, at this point, I want to thank very much our invited speaker today, Kim Wright, for an extraordinarily useful and practical webinar that we can all put to use almost immediately. And thank you all to our participants for joining us today as well.